I'm going to draw it here. Actually, you can see it a little more closely. So let's say we have our, membrane, right? Here's our phospholipid bilayer, right? Okay. And I won't draw the whole thing. I'll stop about there. And remember, if this is inside, right, and this is outside, we're going to have inside as, at the resting potential, minus 65 millivolts. It's more negative on the inside, right? Certain level of polarization, right? How do we change that relationship to make this more negative inside? How do we hyperpolarize this particular cell? We want to go from minus 65 to minus 80, let's say, millivolts, right? Well, one way you can do it, right, is to bring in something negative, right? And just think, if you're, sodium is such an important ion that's going to be, actually it'll turn out carrying the electrical message from one end of the neuron to the other. It's an important part of your diet, right? You get sodium from salt, right? And sodium comes, as this positive sodium ion, allied with or linked to a negative chloride ion. And, I haven't described any mechanisms for, any protein machines that allow for the passage of chloride across, this membrane, which is impermeable. So there's not a lot of chloride in here. There's a very low concentration of chloride in here. Very little chloride at all in a typical neuron. But a lot of chloride will be out here because it's from your diet, right? So it ended up in the extracellular space, right? So if you open a channel in a neuron, if a neuron opens a channel that allows for the passage of chloride, right? Well, that chloride is going to be driven inside the cell, right? There's a lot of chloride out here. There's no chloride in here. So what force drives chloride into the cell? It's the concentration gradient force, right? But, as it comes in, it's a negatively charged ion. It's going to make things more negative inside the cell. It'll go from minus 65 to minus 80. Ultimately, it'll stop coming in, though, right? Because as you increase the polarization, as you hyperpolarize, right, you're making it more and more and more negative in here, and chloride is a negatively charged ion. So which force is going to oppose, ultimately, and prevent its further entry into the cell? It'll be the electrical force. So this gives you another example of how where an ion will move, or where the bulk of ions will move, is sort of, sometimes these forces that are acting on movement, provoking it to move in one direction or another, are aligned, like in the case of sodium, right, where you have a lot of it out here, right, and it's positively charged. It really wants to come in, right, as soon as it gets an opportunity. Chloride, however, will come in because there's so much of it out here, so the concentration gradient force will drive it in, but it'll be opposed by the electrical force, and ultimately that electrical force will prevent it. Once it reaches a certain level of hyperpolarization, more different than the resting potential. Okay, think of one more way you can actually hyperpolarize the cell. How else can you, go from minus 65, say, in terms of the charge difference between inside and out, to minus 80, right? You could bring in a negatively charged ion. You could also take out something that's positively charged, right? And so another way to hyperpolarize a cell, right? Remember, we've got a lot of potassium in here, right? And less potassium on the outside, right? If you open more channels that allow for potassium to flow through, potassium will flow out, and you're taking positive away from the inside, right? So you're going to go from minus 65 to around minus 80. You're going to hyperpolarize the cell this way too. What I want you to think about is that the potential difference, the difference in charge between the inside and the out, is dependent upon where these ions actually go, right? By moving ions from one location to another, you change the relationship. You can go from the resting potential, for example, to a more hyperpolarized state. Okay, so a certain level of polarization exists, right, at the resting potential, and we can measure it, right? It's minus 65 millivolts more negative inside versus the outside, right? We've talked about two mechanisms by which you can hyperpolarize, right? Increase that difference in charge by making it more negative inside versus the outside, going from minus 65 to, let's say, minus 80. You can bring in negative ions like chloride. You can take out, positive ions like potassium, right? You can also go the other way. You can actually reduce the difference in charge between the inside and the out, vis-a-vis the resting potential. You can go from minus 65 and go to minus 55, right, or to minus 45. And so if a neuron becomes less negative on the inside, right, versus the outside from the resting potential, if the polarization decreases, we refer to this as a depolarized neuron. We're reducing the difference in charge between the inside and the out. And I want to also go over some mechanisms by which this could occur, right? So if we have our typical neuron, right, with our phospholipid bilayer, and we have our inside, right, and we have our outside, and at rest, it's minus 65 millivolts, right? One way we can actually, reduce this, take it down to minus, let's say, 55 millivolts, right, or minus 40 millivolts, right? That's depolarizing it. We can open a channel, right, that will allow for positive ions to come in, right? So our great candidate for this kind of activity is, of course, the sodium ion. Remember, the pump has kicked it all outside, right? The membrane is generally not very permeable to sodium, and it's a positively charged ion, and the inside is negatively charged. So if you open channels, right, if the neuron opens channels that allow for sodium to pass through, the concentration gradient force and the electrical force are aligned to really drive sodium into the cell, right, into that neuron. And by bringing in positive charges, you are going to reduce the negativity, right, the negative kind of charge aspect of the inside of the neuron, and depolarize this cell, from minus 65 to minus 55 to minus 40 millivolts. So the key here is that polarization, just refers to the difference in charge across the membrane. There's a certain level of difference that we've measured, right? Minus 65, which constitutes what we refer to as the resting potential difference, right, between inside and out. And by moving ions across the membrane, by changing the permeability of the membrane, right, to the passage of particular ions, charged particles like chloride or sodium or potassium, we can alter that difference in charge. We can actually change the polarization. We can hyperpolarize. We can make it more negative inside versus the out, right? We can increase that difference or polarization between inside or outside. And we can also reduce it. We can depolarize it. And it's going to involve opening protein channels, right? And allowing for the passage of ions in order to change that charge relationship inside versus out.